Hi, Anna. All right, hey, let's get going. We left off yesterday talking about the elastic clause, the clause in the Constitution that basically allows the legislative branch to stretch the limits of the Constitution. In other words, if something's not spelled out specifically in the Constitution, there's a possibility in the necessary and proper or the elastic clause that the legislative branch can find a way to stretch the Constitution. That's why we call it the elastic clause. And we left off about to play the video clip, which I want to start from scratch on. He does a good job of explaining this. We're going to do a couple things here. We're going to finish the first packet. I shared digitally at 1:35 p.m. another packet. It should populate your Google Classroom stream. And I also shared with you, I don't know whether it's hit yet, but I shared with you a study deck of review terms for our first unit on the U.S. Constitution and the American Revolution. There's 25 or 30 vocab terms on a Quizlet deck that I created that I want you to start taking a look at to kind of begin preparing for like a review plan for the end of the school year in the regions. It's 25 terms, it's one study deck. I have about 6 or 7 that I'll create, but I've given you the first one just so you can start thinking about putting a plan together to review. I know June seems like a long way off, but it comes up quick. Hi, Palin. So, necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. we're going to look at where we left off on slide number 10 of our packet, and we're going to pick up a video clip. Now, I'm experimenting. I'm finding more and more new features of my view board. Look where I've got the things I'm always moving around. I put them over on the right today. See them there? These things that I'm constantly rearranging. Fingers crossed, guys. I'm going to hit the next button, and I think I figured out how to leave them in the same spot every screen. So, all right, good to go. All right, I might have to jiggle them. But, all right, let's take a look at the elastic clause.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to HVCC History. I was just talking to a kid, and I asked the kid what the elastic clause was, and he said it means Congress can do anything it wants that's necessary and proper. And I said, Doe, you are wrong. Everybody out there, we need to understand the elastic clause if you're going to understand federalism in the least. So let's start really quick with the definition, and if you know who I am, you know I do this all the time. Federalism is the division of power between the federal government and the states, and how we define that is with the U.S. Constitution. So basically, the state power rests in the 10th Amendment. Right? The 10th Amendment reserved power states that anything that's not in the Constitution, that's not given to the federal government to do, is reserved for the states, which means that the federal government gets its power from the Constitution. So when we look at the Constitution and we look for governmental power, federal power, it's really all over, but its biggest concentration is in Article 1, Section 8. This is called delegated power. Article 1 is legislative, and Article 8 is a list of delegated power. We can start with some really big ones. For instance,
so before we answer that question, he just made a point, and I want to reiterate it, that when we talk about Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1 is the very first section of the Constitution, and that lays out the legislative branch of government. Article 2 is which branch? The executive branch. And Article 2 speaks to the powers of the branch of the chief executive, or the office of the presidency. Article 3 of the Constitution is going to be the judicial branch. So when Hughes or me or anybody else talks about Article 1, bells should go off over your head. You recognize Article 1 is the first section of the Constitution, Article 1 the first section, and Article 1 deals exclusively with the legislative branch. It is not a coincidence, in my view, that the legislative branch is the first branch listed and the first branch spelled out in the Constitution. Okay? Article 1 legislative, Article 2 executive, Article 3 is the judicial branch. How many articles are there in the Constitution? There's 27 amendments, but there are only 7 articles or 7 sections. We'll talk about the other 4 sections as the year moves on, but quick recap there. All right, so Hip's question here on this section. Article 1, Section 8 is a list of powers delegated or granted to the federal government. These are referred to as delegated powers. It's not so much a question as it is a note. Okay, continue.
For instance, it says to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. It gives the government the ability to coin money and collect taxes. It gives the government the ability to regulate trade between the states and commerce, and to promote the useful arts, and there's kind of military stuff in there. And then we get to the elastic clause, right? So if you're going to learn anything, know the 10th Amendment and know Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. It's the last one in delegated powers. And we can put it up on the wall.
To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department.
Note, this clause is the last part of document 1 for short essay questions. So he's speaking to Regents Sam. Understanding its meaning and purpose is essential to analyzing documents. So I'm going to tell you that this section of the Constitution speaks specifically to Congress's ability to make laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry out the execution of the foregoing powers. In other words, it gives the Congress a great amount of latitude in terms of what it can do under the Constitution. Again, it gives it the elasticity, the ability to stretch the Constitution. Okay?
Or officer thereof.
So if the federal government's going to do it, and it's not specifically in the language of the Constitution, is it constitutional? Can we do that? Yeah. If we can rationalize that what we are doing is to execute one of those delegated powers. So if you're an original intentionalist, you're looking at those words very carefully, and you want really a direct line between the law being passed and the actual words, and maybe even what you think the founders meant. That's intentionalism, and you're really going to limit the federal government. And that's definitely, you know, a legitimate ideology. On the other side of the coin, we have language in the delegated powers that's a little broad, to promote the general welfare, to regulate the commerce between the states. So that type of language has been used with the elastic clause next to it to do some things that aren't directly in the Constitution. The National Bank was created because the government has the power, according to the Constitution, to borrow money, to establish credit, and Hamilton argued that the elastic clause.
So that's a great example. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the country has a right to establish specifically a national bank. But the Constitution does say that the United States has the ability to borrow money. Now, if you're borrowing money as a nation, if you were borrowing money from another country or another country or another part of the world, it makes sense that if you borrow money, you should have a place to do what with that money? To place it, to store it. So that is where the Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution comes into play, with this idea that there's some elasticity. Thank you, Katie. There's some elasticity to what can and cannot be done.
Gave the government that corresponding power to create a national bank to execute that foregoing power. So you decide. You decide whether you want to be somebody who is expanding.
All right, let's stop there and go back and finish up on this topic before we move on. All right, so. I'm not liking that. Not back to where it should be, but we'll figure it out. One more Supreme Court case today that we need to talk about that underscores Marshall's court. We said yesterday that the hallmark of the Marshall court was what? The supremacy of, the supremacy of what power? Whose power? The Marshall court basically, in its decisions, are going to be decisions that favor what entity over another? The national government over state government. It's going to be a court that kind of characterizes the supremacy of the national government. So Gibbons v. Ogden is the third case this lesson. We talked about two yesterday. We talked about Dartmouth College versus Woodward. We talked about McCulloch versus Maryland, and I posted a video clip on those last night for you to watch by Friday. The third one is Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824. This case involves steamboat licenses and state versus federal authority. And the key thing I want you to realize here on Gibbons v. Ogden, again, I'm going to highlight this, is that it established that the federal government's authority over interstate commerce. It basically says, Gibbons v. Ogden, that the federal government, the national government, has the ability to regulate commerce between states. And it's going to limit states' ability to regulate trade between states. Gibbons v. Ogden, interstate commerce regarding boats and ships. And it's going to establish, again, not to repeat it countless times, but it's going to establish the supremacy of the national government over the individual state governments. We said yesterday that Marshall's court was characterized by decisions that are going to favor the supremacy of the national government over the state governments. Okay? The two, though, that I really need you to key in on this week are McCulloch versus Maryland, Supreme Court case, and Dartmouth College v. Woodward. Both important cases under Supreme Court led by John Marshall. Okay, let's go to the next one, please. Impact on states' rights. Okay, impacts on states' rights. The Marshall Court, again, we're talking about the Marshall Court, how the judicial branch of government is going to kind of become preeminent in the period after the War of 1812. The Marshall Court and their decisions are going to favor federal power. It's going to limit the ability of states to interfere with federal policies. So state powers are not going to be able to overturn decisions that the Supreme Court makes. State powers are going to be subordinate to federal powers under the Marshall Court. And this is going to create tension because a lot of states, especially your southern states, subscribe to this idea of what are called states' rights, the idea that a state should basically be able to determine what it wants to do, what laws it wants to have, what, for example, on the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery will be a classic states' rights case. Southerners, white Southerners who own slaves, do not want Northern abolitionists telling them that they have to free their slaves, because they view slavery as a state right. They view slavery as a right that is inherent in the state that they live in. And eventually that will be challenged, but we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves right now. Alyssa, when we were talking earlier this week, what did we say were the three sections of the country that are going to start to become more and more at odds with each other? The North, the South, and the West. The North, South, and the West. And Katie, what was the purpose of Clay's American system with respect to those three sections of the country, North, South, and West? What did he hope to accomplish with his American system? To kind of bring them together and connect them through the economy and through infrastructure and through industry. Very good. All right. Next up. Conclusion. The legacy of post-war nationalism. Let's talk about post-war. We're talking War of 1812. Quick recap. Nationalism after the War of 1812 is going to shape our economic policy and our judicial decisions. Nationalism after the war is going to shape our economic and our judicial decisions. It's going to lead to a stronger federal government and more unified national economy. Haley, what is something we learned yesterday that from a banking standpoint is going to help create a unified national economy? This was part of Clay's plan. Clay wanted to create a national bank and have basically one what? One currency. One currency that would be legal in every state. All right? Now, the effects are still visible in modern American government and economy. There's no getting around this. We still have sectionalism in our country today in terms of economic way of life. Still, the American South is and the American West are home to some of the largest farmlands in the country. More manufacturing occurs in the North still than in the South, although the South has picked it up immensely. And also, the size of our country has gotten a lot bigger since this period of time. We've almost tripled the size of our nation since 1816, and our economic sections are much broader and much wider and just simply larger than originally. All right? Is that the last slide? Did we get through all 15? I don't think we did we? I don't think I skipped, did I? Did I skip one or two? All right, so we're gonna skip there, and we're gonna move right into packet 2. Now, can you guys tell me, did the Quizlet link populate your Google Stream? Should be added near the top, a link with 25 vocab terms. All right, so just kind of keep that for folks that got here a little bit late. I shared a Quizlet study deck with you, Katie and Blake, that you can start studying for as we start to prepare for our regents. Again, I'm not trying to alarm anybody by saying, the regents is almost 8 months off, but I like to prepare sooner rather than later, so I'm gonna start giving you stuff little by little to help you review. Let's open up our next packet, and we're gonna really do a deep dive in the time we have left into sectionalism and conflict in antebellum America. I'm gonna put you on the spot, Miss Poor. I'm gonna put you on the spot, Palin, and I'm gonna ask you if you can tell me what that word means right there. Sectionalism and conflict in antebellum America. From the Greek bellicose, which means warlike. What do you think sectionalism, conflict in antebellum America means? Yeah, sectionalism, conflict, A-N-T-E, before, okay? Before the war. And what war do you think we're talking about? The Civil War, the American Civil War, which will happen in 1861. So we're going to talk about sectionalism and conflict in antebellum America, the period of time before the war. Period of time before the war. All right? All right, let's go to the next one, please. Let's introduce sectionalism. And again, quick recap, because we talked about it a lot this week already. Sectionalism is loyalty to a particular region over the nation. If you were to ask most people in 1820, were you an American, or were you a New Yorker, or a Massachusetts resident, or were you a Virginian? Most people would not have identified as an American. They would identify first with their state. Most people did not have the sense that we have today of nation. If I'm on a boat somewhere, and this happened on my honeymoon, I'm on my honeymoon almost, holy crap, 35 years ago. And we met people from all over the world where I went. And somebody asked me where I was from. And my first response, I didn't tell them Clifton Park because they wouldn't what?
No.
They wouldn't know. I didn't initially tell them New York because they had a foreign accent and I didn't know whether maybe they would know. So what do you think I told them? I live in the United States. And then they kind of drilled down, well, where in the United States do you live? And I told them New York, and I live in a suburb of Albany. But back here in 1820, if someone approached someone about where they lived or who they were, they would proudly say, I'm a Virginian, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a Rhode Islander. Their first association and their first loyalty was to their state or their region. And that is especially going to become important as we move closer to 1861, because those divides between sections are going to become more sharp, definitely more sharp between the sections of the country. Now, as Alyssa said, we divided the country into three main sections: north, south, and west. And basically, in 1825, the three sections are going to be here. Three sections are going to be here, here, and here. Okay? North, south, west. Okay? In 1820. Each section had distinct economic interests and cultural values. Each section had distinct economic interests and cultural values. The way of life was a lot different in the north than in the south. South was industrial, or excuse me, the north was industrial, and the south was more agricultural. Accents were different. People spoke with different accents in the two sections of the country. Their vocabulary might be different, even. Education is going to be more prominent in the north, so people are going to speak maybe more formally, or more formal in the north than they would in the south. There's going to be slang that will be used in the north that won't be used in the south, and slang that will be used in the south that won't be used in the north. So each section had distinct economic interests and distinct cultures. And these differences are going to absolutely lead to conflict between the sections of the country. all three of these sections are going to think that their section is the best, and that their section is the one that government should be most focused on, and each section of the country is going to develop this idea that their section of the country should be the most prominent. We are the United States in 1820, but we were united, I would say, in name only. Most people identified primarily with their region or their state. Is everybody clear on that? All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. Let's talk about the North first. All right, let's talk about the North. We're going to talk about the North and its way of life. The North, as we know, was industrial and commercial, focused on manufacturing and commerce. And there's a great shot of, this is probably a 20th century factory, not a 19th century factory, but this is what a factory would have been like in the North. Very, very cramped. Lots of people. This looks like a textile mill. People are sewing fabric. The North is going to support protective tariffs to boost domestic industry. Northerners are going to support tariffs, which we said were taxes on imports coming in. Okay, imports coming in. The North is also going to favor a strong federal government and internal improvement. So the North is going to be gaga. North is going to be, as far as improving infrastructure and improving the roads and bridges and canals and the like, the North is going to be really, really excited about these federal improvements, because they're going to help, those improvements are going to help goods ship. Think of a spider's web. Think of a spider's web in the North. The North is looking for ways to get their goods from place to place, and there's a wonderful map we'll see later in the school year of the railroad systems in the United States and the tracks. Where do you think most of the tracks are going to be? In the North. And it's a railroad map, and it literally looks like a spider web, the way that the North has tracks literally coming out of every city and every town. Incredible. All right. So the North is going to favor a strong federal government and internal improvements. And this is important, girls and guys. I want you to note this too. As we get into the 1820s, as 1820s start to hit, we're going to see more and more Northerners begin to speak out against slavery. Now, this is not to say, because it wasn't this way at all, it was not to say that Northerners believed in equality. They, in large numbers, did not. But Northerners are going to start to speak out against the horror and the inhumanity of slavery. And this is important because as Northerners begin to speak out, Southerners are listening. As more and more Northern politicians and as more and more Northern whites begin to speak out on slavery and oppose slavery, Southerners are listening, and they're listening very keenly. And when a Northerner says slavery is immoral, or slavery is wrong, or slavery is evil, or, here's another argument many Northern Christians would make, Northerners would argue that slavery went against whose design? God's design. Slavery, in other words, was to own slaves was sinful. When Southerners start to hear that kind of talk, white Southerners become very, very defensive, and white Southerners become very, very resolute in making sure that their way of life in air quotes, their way of life, whenever you hear Southerners speak in this period of time about the Southern way of life, they're almost always speaking about the institution of slavery being protected. So as Northerners begin to talk about abolishing slavery, and Southerners are listening, and it's deepening the mistrust, and it's deepening the rift between the Northern states and the Southern states. Okay? You guys with me so far? If I'm going too quick, please tell me. All right? If I'm going too quick, please tell me. I don't think I am, but if I am, let me know. Let's talk about the South. Unlike the North, it's based on cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. And the Southern agricultural and slave-based economy is going to rely not entirely, but heavily on slave labor. There were plenty of poor whites that rented land. There were plenty of whites that operated small farms, but the largest segment of the economy in the South is going to rely on slave labor. Okay, large plantations rather are going to sometimes have upwards of 500, 600, 700 slaves, and sometimes more, depending on the amount of land that was owned. Southerners are going to oppose high tariffs that raise prices on imported goods. Why? Because Southerners imported lots of goods. And if the tariffs are going to raise prices on Southern goods, that means Southerners are going to have to pay more for those goods. Southerners favored states' rights over federal power. So when John Marshall is making these Supreme Court decisions, it basically established the federal government as supreme over states. Southerners are taking notice as well and saying, whoa, wait a sec, okay? We're all about states' rights. We should be able to decide whether we want to own slaves. We don't want the government in Washington, D.C. making that decision. We want Northerners making that decision for us. If we own slaves, damn it, we want to own slaves. And Southerners, Southern whites, are going to recognize that federal power could pose a threat to states' rights. For example, if the Supreme Court cases we've talked about basically said that federal law trumps state law, federal law trumps or overrules states' laws, you can tell Southerners are going to be really, really scared about the institution of slavery, because if federal power trumps state laws, federal government could one day try to do what with slavery? Abolish it. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we know the difference between the northern and southern economies. It's largely agricultural in the South and farming, and it's largely manufacturing and industry and banking in the North. What about the West? Okay, the Western frontier, and this was the true frontier in the area after the war. The West and frontier expansion. Now, the West, as we said, was a very, very small area compared to, our country today. The West was basically this area here, the yellow area south of the Great Lakes. It was not a large area, but the country was getting bigger. Country doubled in size in 1803. Alyssa, due to what? The country doubled in size in the year 1803 due to what? What was the big land purchase that doubled our country's size? Thomas Jefferson made it in 1803. LP. Help her out, somebody. Louisiana Purchase. So the country's getting bigger physically, and that's opening up the floodgates to people to travel west. So when we talk about the western frontier, we're talking about focusing on westward expansion and settlement. And guys and girls, this is going to be huge. If people are moving west, and they're moving west from southern states, like South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, what do people bring with them when they move places? They just bring their luggage and their furniture? They want to bring their slaves with them. And if they own slaves, they want to expand their slaves with them as they move and as they find new land. So this issue of focusing on westward expansion and settlement is going to basically be another dividing area between North and South. Northerners are going to be growing in their opposition to allowing slavery to move into new territories, and Southerners feel, hey, it's my right. If I'm a white Southerner, I should be able to, if I'm a slaveholder in the South, and I have a kitchen table, and I have a rocking chair, and I have a clock, and I have a cart, or a wagon, and 2 horses, can anybody tell me I can't bring those items on a trip if I'm moving west to settle west of the Appalachians? No, and the argument Southerners are going to make is that slave that I own, or those slaves that I own, are nothing more than a piece of property. And that's the point of view that they're going to argue their case from. Now, the West involved cheap land and internal improvements. They needed cheap land and internal improvements to connect that to the rest of the country. Clay, we said, was a Kentuckian. Clay wants to make land cheap for people to move west, and he wants to be able to connect the West to both the North and the South. There's going to be mixed views on slavery. It's going to be often dependent upon geography, depending on what part of the West you are moving to. If you are moving to the West on the southern part of the United States, great farmland. If you're moving west in the northern part of the United States, depends on where exactly, but the farmland is going to vary. But those are the three parts of the country that we're looking at, and each of those three sections, I'm not going to call them parts anymore, I'm going to call them sections, because sectionalism is going to start to develop after the War of 1812 ends in 1815. And we're going to talk about economic issues now, okay? And we're going to key in on tariffs, okay? Key in on tariffs and the idea of protective tariffs. You might hear in the news today, you watch the news or you listen to local or national news, you might hear this phrase used when a news anchor talks about tariffs, protective tariffs. All that means is it's a tariff designed to protect American businesses from foreign imports. Yes?
Would the West be in conflict a lot since like the people from the North and the people from the South are all moving to that one area? So I feel
Yeah.
like would they have like conflicts
Yeah.
all over because they're just disagreeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Some Northerners, as early as 1820, moving westward, are very resolute in their belief that slavery should not be expanded. Remember what's happening in the North after the American Revolution. What do we say is happening in each of the northern states as early as 1783? Slaves are becoming freed in the northern states. And there's an attitude in the North that if America is expanding west, we should be shrinking the number of slaves that are owned rather than expanding slavery into new territories. There's an attitude among many in the North that slavery should be diminishing. Again, don't equate that necessarily to people believing in equality between blacks and whites, because that wasn't the case. In most instances, yes.
Because in the North they were freeing slaves, would Southern slaveholders that wanted more slaves just go? Like, would they go and take slaves that were already free in the North?
Would Southern slaveholders go north and take slaves that had been freed? Not before the war breaks out. Most Southern slaveholders are going to, and that's a good question. Very few freed slaves, by the way. If you're a New Yorker, or you're a Massachusetts slave, or you're a Rhode Island slave, or you're a Pennsylvania slave, what's the last thing in the world you're probably going to do when you earn your freedom? You're not going to go south, because they realize that going south is a calculated risk. And here's the horror of it. If you are a slave who's granted your freedom in the North, or who buys your freedom, if you're able to buy your freedom, chances are you have loved ones in the South. You might have family, you might have a wife, you might have children, you might have parents. So the temptation is to what? To go south, but most will not because of the danger it will pose. Now, as we get closer to the Civil War, listen, and as slaves begin to escape from the South to the North, okay, then you will see white slave owners hire slave catchers, hire bounty hunters to basically go and search and retrieve and bring back slaves to their proper locations. But generally speaking, at this time, most freed slaves, as long as they steer clear of the South, they would be okay. Some would leave the country. Some are going to move to Canada. Some might go to Europe if they can afford it. Freed slaves in the North, despite being freed in the North in this time period, slaves in the North, freed slaves, free African Americans, are still going to suffer from prejudice and from discrimination, and life in the North is not going to be a bowl of cherries for freed slaves. It'll be better than it would be as a slave, and it will be safer in the North than in the South, but they will not be treated as equals. They're not at that point yet. Yes, Dylan?
This might be a stupid question.
Probably not, but go.
So,
No
like,
question stupid.
So Southerners, you know how they bring their slaves western?
Yeah.
Since they're pushing the Indians and the Native Americans off, would they take any of them as slaves? Or would
Native
that-
Americans?
Yeah. Or would they just push them off their land?
Some Native Americans would be used as indentured servants. Some might be used as slaves. You got to remember, by this time in our history, slavery is almost entirely based on skin color. Slavery is almost entirely based on skin color. So if you could pass for someone who is not African, if you had a skin color complexion that was light-skinned or maybe mulatto, you would stand a pretty good chance of not being enslaved by virtue of how you appeared. The term is passing. If you could pass yourself off as white or as Native American, you'd most likely be safe. That's not a stupid question at all. But generally speaking, the darker the skin tone, the worse the risk for your safety and your freedom. Because regardless of where you lived in the South, if you were a free African American or you were a slave, you ran the risk. Even as a free African American, you ran the risk of being pulled into slavery or pulled back into slavery by virtue of the color of your skin. So Native Americans not so much, although Native Americans were pushed off their land, okay, most of the slave population is going to be comprised of Africans. All right, so protective tariffs are going to be tariffs on imported goods designed to protect domestic industries. So the bootmaker in Massachusetts, or let's say the fabric maker in Lowell, who works in one of the Lowell mills. Let's say that there's now going to be a tariff on imported fabric from England. That is designed specifically to protect those Lowell factory workers and that Lowell factory owner, so he or she can sell more of their factory products, okay? In the North, again, they support high tariffs to protect manufacturing. In the South, they oppose high tariffs, which raise prices on goods that they needed. Now, I'm going to part on this question today. Anybody, I'm not going to single anybody out. Anybody can answer, so I should see your hands go up. South opposes high tariffs because they're importing a lot of goods from England. Why else are they going to support tariffs? Even if they don't import their goods from England, why are they not going to like high tariffs? Lizzie first, I saw. They're going to have to rely on the North for those goods, and the North and the South, we're starting to see this division, this sectionalism between them that makes the South reluctant to feel like they have to rely on the North because of the two different ways of life that are starting to develop.